The more people you speak to about recording on tape that had done it a lot in the day, the more people will tell you it wasn't special. They don't miss it. You're ruining transients sometimes. You could get a perfect take that sounded one way in the room, sounds totally different afterwards. These are all negatives. But you know what a positive was? Making decisions. Having to make decisions on the spot about what was good and what was bad, and not having the ability to undo was extremely helpful. So if you can work using modern technology, but in the way of the past, the way they used to do it, I think you'll be way better off. Let me give you an example from citing Brendan O'Brien's interview with Rick Beato. I didn't know Brendan O'Brien played the guitar solo on Black Crowes Hard to Handle. I had no idea he did that. It's fair use for teaching purposes. Fair use for teaching purposes.
The solo came about where it was like we're like literally at the studio, Paramount Studios in LA, and I think we're there their last day, and this got to be done.
Yeah.
And it was like, you know, Chris like, Bud can play. I think he can play this stuff because Jeff Cease was not there. They were all back in Atlanta, and the guitar player. And so I went out and did a take, and George, okay, fine. Well, I think I kind of missed one part. Can I? Yeah, okay. You know, a couple of takes, and I borrowed Rick's guitar. Rick had a Les Paul in his bedroom, and he sent it over, and we rented a Marshall amp, or it might have been there, and that's how I did it. And there's a little part in there that
bugs you or something, or what?
No, it's just rushed. And it's in the solo. It doesn't bug me, but Dean DeLeo every now and then would call me, much later. Yeah. Hey, man, heard that solo again. Great. That part's still a little rushed. Still a little ahead. I noticed that. Still haven't fixed that, have you?
Brendan.
Millions and millions of copies sold, and still a part he played bugs him a little bit. But you know who it doesn't bug? The people who bought the millions and millions and millions of copies. It doesn't bug the listener in the least. I'm a musician, I play guitar, and I'm very in tune with timing. Yet, every single time I hear that solo, I love it. I never in my mind think this is weird or bad, and that's why Rick is laughing his butt off, because it's such a great, amazing solo, and there's no chance that anybody could interpret what he did as rushed. It's just the way it feels is great. We all interpret it from a feel perspective because we didn't play it. We don't know exactly what was intended, so we are looking at it from a listener's perspective. You got to translate this to what you're doing when you're making music, okay? The concept is you know what you want to do, so you know when you don't achieve it the way you want. But if you separate yourself from the guy playing it to being the guy listening to it as the producer, the one who's deciding whether the takes have the feel and the emotion they need to carry the song, then you can assess whether it makes sense to redo this thing a bunch of times or not. Because it was tape, you can't undo. And if it's at the end of the project, like he's saying, in other words, they had to let him do it because they only had, this was the last day in the studio. So the fact that there was deadlines, the fact that they had money spent on a studio that was about to be done that day meant there were no options for, let's get Jeff Cease to play it. Let's get, there were no options to bring in other people to play it. Even the guys in the band, it was, can we do it? This guy can play, let's do it. And that concept of keeping the momentum going is a big part of what makes records great, because you're living in the moment, you're taking advantage of the momentum, and when that's happening, magic can occur. Instead of the way we would work today, where if it doesn't matter, if you have no deadline, if it's your own project and nobody's waiting for it, you wind up just doing things over and over and over again, and it doesn't make them better. You'll wait a week, you'll say, oh, it's scrape but here, you'll wind up waiting, it goes in the back burner forever, for weeks. This is what happens to us. So we gotta let go of this idea that perfect is the way to go. Let go of the idea of the way you intended it to be done may be slightly different, and grasp the idea that you now need to become the listener, the producer, and decide if this thing is good enough. If you're playing artist and producer roles, you need to split that up. It's the same way if you're playing engineer and mixer roles, or like engineer and producer roles. In other words, focus on the sonics first. That's always what I do. I try to get the sounds as good as possible. If I'm being both engineer and producer, get the sound as good as possible on everything you're recording. Then you got to move over to listening to the performances and judging how they feel and deciding if you achieved the right feeling. But now you're no longer thinking about the sonics. You have to be able to move within yourself in this way where you can be both people. Otherwise, you wind up drilling things to perfection, and it's not always better. So also look at this. In the days of tape, right? You couldn't undo things. You had to decide at that time whether you liked what you did or not, because you can't do it again and then get that back. You've recorded over it. So the concept is you're always running out of tracks. There were never enough tracks. Things would share tracks. And a lot of times, if you have only this one spot for a guitar solo, you can't put 7 tracks of guitar solos down and then pick the one you like later and comp it together. And the great thing is better things were created because of that. In other words, when you are using your digital, your DAW to record your band, what you're basically doing is giving yourself an unlimited amount of tracks that you can ultimately comp forever if you want to create the best of all these different things. And that's not really good, in my opinion. What you really want to do is make decisions as you go. You want to decide on the best drum track, the best bass track, the best rhythm tracks. You decide, and you don't look back. You make the decisions on what is good at the time you record it. That way you have a solid foundation from the ground up instead of a constantly moving, floor in your building. You can't have the floor be moving in your building. You're building on quicksand. You understand what I'm saying? The whole structure is on quicksand if you're trying to build something up and you never decided on anything the entire way. You need to decide. Just like they had to make a decision whether this was good enough, and it was so good that nobody could say, hey man, this one little spot warrants us doing this whole thing again and trying to maintain the same feel, the same groove. And guess what? Thank goodness they didn't, because how many more millions of copies you think that thing could have sold if whatever part of it wasn't rushed? Not relevant what that was. The point is, what's relevant is the fact that nobody could hear the difference from what was in his head to what we're listening to, because the feel is there. The feel is right. And Dean DeLeo's busting his chops because Brendan, when he recorded Dean in Stone Temple Pilots, that he was busting Dean's chops about, because he was listening to the performances. He's the producer. He's like, hey man, maybe you should do that again, or what. He's obviously said that, so Dean's throwing it back at him. That's what we do. No big deal. But the point is, these guys know that when the feel is there, it's right. You guys should internalize this also, because it will prevent you from recording your songs 100 times, never being happy, waiting too long, getting out of the moment, all the stuff we all go through. All right? So use the tools of today and work as if it was the days of yesterday, the past with the tape. And trust me, you'll be way better off. Get set on all your tracks as you go. Let me know if there's any tricks you guys are using that are like tricks of yesterday that get applied today in the modern world in some cool fashion in order to get stuff that's going to sound just more real, with more feel and more emotion, or any just techniques that you use from then and apply to now in some new way. I'd love to hear about it. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.